This is the first video in a series that I'll be doing on Holy Scripture. In this video, I'll be discussing the Old Testament. A very common question that I hear from people who are looking into Orthodox Christianity for the first time is why the Orthodox Old Testament differs from the Protestant one that they're familiar with. The reason for this is that we use the Greek Old Testament, called the Septuagint, instead of the Hebrew Old Testament, called the Masoretic. The Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt, sometime between 300 and 100 BC. According to Philo of Alexandria, King Ptolemy II of Egypt wished to read a translation of the Jewish scriptures in his own language. He gathered 72 Jews who were fluent in both Hebrew and Greek, and locked them each in a separate chamber with orders to translate their scriptures. After 72 days, each man emerged from his respective chamber and gave his finished translation to the king. Upon comparing their translations, it was found that they matched word for word with each other. This miraculous translation became known as the Septuagint, which in Latin means from 70. And in many ways, it took on a life of its own. By the time of Christ, we know that the Jews had come to accept that this translation was by divine inspiration, and therefore bore divine authority. Philo, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and Josephus, who lived in Jerusalem, and who both lived about the same time that Christ lived, both write about the divine origins of the Septuagint. Eventually, however, the Jews came to reject the Septuagint and embrace the Masoretic. Why did they do this? There are probably a number of reasons, but there are two major ones that we know of. First, their change of scripture was due to their understanding that because the Masoretic was in Hebrew, it must more closely match with the original words of Moses and the other Hebrew authors than the Greek Septuagint. Similarly, they also decided to exclude books which they had previously considered scriptural, but believed were originally written in Greek and not Hebrew. As Hebrew was their sacred language, they believed that it had to have been written in Hebrew originally in order to be a sacred book. Archaeologists and historians today, however, know that they mistakenly eliminated several books which were indeed originally written in Hebrew, such as Sirach and the first book of Maccabees. Secondly, the Jews changed from the Septuagint to the Masoretic as a measure taken against Christians. The Christians, arising out of first-century Judaism, accepted belief in the divine inspiration of the Septuagint. Second and third century Jews, as a way of disowning and combating Christians, decided to reject the Septuagint. As early as about AD 150, St. Justin the Philosopher wrote that Jews were altering or disowning passages of Scripture that contained prophecies Christians claimed to have fulfilled. For instance, in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, he writes, "And from the 95th Psalm they have taken away this short saying of the words of David, from the wood. For when the passage said, 'Tell ye among the nations the Lord hath reigned from the wood,' they have left, 'Tell ye among the nations the Lord hath reigned.'" He explains that the Jewish leadership has removed this short phrase because Christians claim that the wood the Lord reigned from was the wood of the cross. Another example of this anti-Christian editing of Scripture is written about by St. Irenaeus of Lyons in about AD 180. "God then was made man, and the Lord did himself save us, giving us the token of the virgin. But not as some allege among those now presuming to expound the Scripture, behold, a young woman shall conceive and bring forth a son." Jewish translators, attempting to make a new translation from the Hebrew into the Greek, which would replace the Septuagint, intentionally altered Isaiah 7:14 to read young woman rather than virgin, because Christians claimed that Christ had fulfilled the prophecy by being born of the Virgin Mary. Christians since Christ have used the Septuagint. Of the approximately 350 quotes from the Old Testament contained in the New Testament, about 300 of them are direct word for word from the Septuagint. Only 6 times out of those 350 does the New Testament quote agree with the Masoretic over the Septuagint. In addition, the New Testament makes quite a few quotes and allusions to the books of the Septuagint which the Masoretic doesn't even contain. So why do Protestants use the Masoretic instead of the Septuagint? Martin Luther in the 16th century decided to use the Masoretic for two major reasons, ones which are very similar to the Jews of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. First, he assumed that because the Masoretic was in Hebrew and the Septuagint was in Greek, the Masoretic must more closely match the original Hebrew than most of the Old Testament was written in. This assumption has been proven incorrect in the 20th century by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain the oldest fragments of the Old Testament in Hebrew that we have, and consistently agree with the Septuagint over the Masoretic. Secondly, the additional books of the Old Testament which the Septuagint contains also taught some things that Protestants disagreed with, such as prayer for the dead. Modern Protestant Bibles, while still not including the additional books and parts of books that the Septuagint contains, sometimes include differences between the Masoretic's and Septuagint's readings of certain passages in the footnotes as textual variants. The fact remains, though, that the Septuagint was the Bible of Christ, his apostles, and all early Christians. It is more than just a textual variant or different reading. It is the inspired Old Testament of Christianity. This is why the Orthodox accept it and reject the Masoretic. If you'd like to explore the history of the Christian Old Testament a little further and take a look for yourself at the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic, I've got some links to a couple of great websites in my sidebar to the right. I also have a link there to a site where you can read the Septuagint, including its additional books, for yourself. I invite you to take a look at the Bible that Christ and his apostles knew, and which the Orthodox Christian Church preserves and uses to this day. Please rate, please comment, please subscribe, and don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have. Share this video with anyone you think might be interested in this topic. Thanks for watching, and most of all, I hope you learned something.